Welcome to the Dominator. I'm your fantasy conciliary, Dan Williamson, the overhyped sweeper. You can find me on X at overhyped sweeper. Just drop that final E from sweeper. And today I have a guest who is really making a name for himself on X. He's a fantastic aggregator of all the news and rumors that matter to us fantasy gamers, but more importantly, he's been digging into the stats and producing analysis that can really make anybody a sharper drafter. Zane Danani is with me today, so let's get right to it. It is time to dominate. All right, welcome Zane. How you doing?
What's going on? I'm ready to be dominated.
Yeah, there you go. So just to start with, tell me a little bit about yourself. Tell our audience a little bit about yourself. How you got started playing fantasy. How long you've been doing it. Favorite formats. Just whatever you want to go into.
Yeah, fantasy has been a part of my life since I was 10 years old. So that was probably 25-ish years ago. So I'm 35. Now that everybody knows that, I can run for president next cycle. But yeah, I've been playing for 25 years. Started out on Yahoo, just like friends leagues, stuff like that. Joining Yahoo public leagues. There used to be message boards where you could join a league. Someone would be like, "Hey, come into this one," and it was all free at the time. Then got deep in the weeds with like a home league that we started back then, and then just kept that continuity going. About 5 or 6 years ago, decided, you know what, like I'm so into this. I read all the news, I do all the analysis, and what I'd really love to do is get into like high stakes drafts. So I started doing the FFPC main event about 5 years ago. Won my league the first year that I joined, and then I started adding more leagues to it. And then I got into underdog best ball as well, and got really deep in the weeds on that. And I actually won the Gauntlet, which is their flagship like playoff tournament. And then I've been maxing out Best Ball Mania for the past 5 years. So, it's just an amalgamation of being a fantasy nut and paying attention to all the news and analytics. And then it just transpired to where, you know what, now I'm going to go out there. I'm going to put my @Danani Zane Twitter handle to work and provide some news and analytics to everybody else.
Love it. Yeah, it's been like I say, it's been some great stuff that you've provided, and I saw you started writing on Fantasy Points a little bit last year, and then you're carrying it through this year as well.
Yeah. So it really started. They had a charter job available where you literally like chart the different games and plays and all sorts of stuff. And I hope Brett Whitefield doesn't mind me mentioning this, but when I went through that process, he told me that I scored higher than anybody else has ever scored on any of his tests, including himself. And Brett Whitefield is a NFL consultant kind of guy. So it really comes down to like reviewing the film, understanding like the concepts of what's going on out there. And I think that's the reason why my content is able to potentially stand out from others, is that I have that ability, and then I have the analytics background. Plus I read literally everything that's out there. And I'm just kind of pushing that all together. I wrote a couple articles last year breaking down the Jaguars offense from a schematic standpoint, like with a bunch of film review as well. And then merging that with analytics. And then I did the same thing with the Seahawks before everyone was talking about the whole like heavy personnel passing stuff. And now translating that into this route depth type of work that I ended up doing this past summer so far, a couple weeks ago, and outputting that as something that I don't think has really been explored, is like what routes people are actually running, how deep they're running, and how that translates into fantasy value.
Yeah, I think it's a great piece, and I think it's just kind of a really nice way to look at the wide receivers in a different sort of light, because there's just been a lot of he goes deep, so he's a great late round shot in a best ball league, and while that might or might not be true, it's you want to look and see, are there any better players that I could be drafting instead of this guy who's just sort of a deep merchant. So. Why don't we just kind of dive right into that article? I found it really intriguing, and I'll put my screen
The
up here.
applications are Yeah, I think the applications to this are wide too. So it's not just kind of like I think you can apply a lot of this back to both redraft, dynasty, and best ball, TFS. Like I think this applies to every single format really that's out there, because the way that it's constructed is thinking through the season long value that the players have, but then also thinking about the individual weeks that people have when it comes to like spike weeks and stuff too. And I think this analysis can really help people through all of those different aspects. So really what I tried to understand through all of this process, but my initial take here was when I was looking at the data and trying to understand what's going on with Brian Thomas from last year, I realized that he started running a lot more deep routes. They turned him into a deep threat once they got Jacoby Myers. And so that was my initial like thesis behind, obviously he had an injury, but also my initial thesis behind, well, is he in a favorable fantasy role in general? Like what are they doing with him? How are they using the player? And then after that, I started digging into the data more and understood that, there's these different like route depths that people are running, and what it actually ends up translating into is differential in fantasy value from a average perspective and then spike week perspective as well. And so when I'm explaining this, there's short routes, and those short routes are going to be 9 yards or less. And then there's intermediate routes that are 10 to 19 yards. And then there's deep routes that are 20 plus yards down the field, right? And so if you think about it, if someone had 3 total routes and they ran one of each, they would have 33% of each. And it's not that common that people run like a 40% or something deep roll. Most people run shorter often because that's just like the time that people have to throw the ball. But on any individual play, you could think about it as there's usually like 5 eligible route participation players, and there's probably 1 guy that's running deep, 2 guys that are running intermediate, and 2 guys that are going short, right?
Yep.
So, and so your average, if you're kind of just like rotating within those 5 like route concepts or depths, is going to be 1/5 or 1/5, right? Mm-hmm. Then I started breaking down the data, thinking through like, okay, what is like too much when it comes to running deep? And what I found was roughly like 20 to 25% is where you start getting into the point where these players are running deeper and it's not necessarily translating into as much fantasy value. And the inverse of that is true as well, right? So
yep.
If they're running deep, and so that those are like the big impacts that end up happening. Shorter passes are easier to complete, which is why that matters, right? So like on a completion percentage basis for quarterbacks, one, they're more accurate throwing shorter, and then the completion percentage on like a 9-yard pass versus a 20-yard pass is going to be like 70% versus like 30%. So if you're running more of those deep ones, you're unlikely to get the ball as often. 1, in terms of target rate, and then 2, in terms of here's the targets per route run that you can see: 27% for short, 16% for intermediate, and 12% for deep. So over double what a deep threat usually does on that individual route. And then you translate it back into like the actual fantasy points per route run, which is what I was thinking through, because most people are thinking about it from a target perspective, but your opportunity is really not just the targets, it's being on the field and running a route. So I always think about it that way and saying like, all right, well, we care about route share. Why don't we care about the depth that they're running in as well? So that's kind of like the breakdown of what I was kind of like thinking throughout the process of making sure like this all kind of made sense for fantasy, and then translating it back into like which players I like based off of all of this analysis.
Yep, totally makes sense. Okay, and you
so
found...
then if we go down to like the average...
Yep.
No, you go for it.
Okay, yeah, I was just going to say then that brings us into this average depth of route sweet spot. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the interesting thing that I found here is that if we're looking at like the top, 5-ish wide receivers every single year in fantasy, they're usually sitting between an average depth of route between like 8 and 11 yards. So that means that they get enough easy button things, they get enough deep things, and enough intermediate things that keep them like relevant on a game by game basis, right? And some of that has to do with like, hey, you're a focal point in the offense, so we're going to do things like give you screens. We're going to do things like have you just run like a quick drag route, and then you're dynamic. You're going to go like make a big play. But it also has to do with the fact that they use them in sporadic ways to send them deep. And when they do that, a guy like JSN last year who ran deep maybe like 15 to 17% of the time. I mean, think about all the times that he ended up scoring deep touchdowns last year. It's because they were able to mix it in more than just saying like, hey, this is your role and you're going every single time like down the field. So that like sweet spot is kind of where you see the biggest like fantasy gain. But it's more valuable to be less than if you're going to go up on the scale, like above the 12, it's less valuable. And if you're below the 8, that's still valuable. It's just there's just like a more like nuanced role. We see guys like Deebo Samuel sitting in that like 7 to 8 yard depth of route. And then I wrote about this in the article too. Khalil Shakir is kind of a mixed bag when it comes to this because he has like 2 of the historically like smallest like average depth of route roles that he's done in the past 2 years. So I think there could be like a theoretical drop off point, and his has been like 5 to 6 yards, which I think is maybe just like too short to be a guy that spikes. But if you're looking for just a guy that's going to like get something like 7, 8 to 10 points, like he could get you that. And then I'm looking at like the deep routes here. You can see some of the names that I pointed out in this article. Alec Pierce, who's been in this like more deep zone of 12 to 16 yards average depth of route. He's been in that zone pretty much his entire career. And I think his ADOT last year was like 19 something, which was by far the most. And guess who the second most was? If I make some season splits, it was Brian Thomas Jr. So you can kind of tell where I'm going with this when it comes to like roles and how they matter for fantasy. Even when you break down the data for Alec Pierce, it's not that his fantasy, like we think about it as like, hey, this guy got 1,000 yards, he scored like 6 or 7 touchdowns. His spike weeks were maybe like 2 or 3 weeks out of the season in general. And like you think when you're drafting him, you're actually getting a guy that's going to spike like 4 or 5 or something times, but it's not the case. It's the guys that are kind of sitting in this like short to intermediate zone.
Yep, totally makes sense. And so as you're doing all this research, this was all half PPR, is that correct?
Yeah, so I was looking at this from a half PPR perspective, mainly because I know that people are drafting on underdog, and then the same concepts apply back to PPR because, that reception is worth more. So the short depth guys get more receptions. The sporadicness of this and the variance that you would see in this next chart that we're going through would actually be bigger when you look at it from a full PPR lens. Now, if you took away the PPR, it would still lean toward the short depth players, but that would like shorten the variance between the two.
Yeah, totally makes sense. So, yeah, the more points per reception you're getting, the more it kind of skews things towards those players who are picking up a lot of receptions, which tend to be the short and intermediate stuff, versus the deep reception or the deep ball players who are, as we go back to this, receptions per route run, the short is 20%, the intermediate 9, and the deep, 0.05. So you're looking at basically 4 times as many receptions per route on the short as you are at the deep. So all of that, if you're putting a half point on, that's one thing. But when you put 1 point on, it just multiplies the effect of it. So that's one of the things I really took out of it is you've just got to be able to get those numbers of receptions if you're playing in a full PPR format. We always talk about PPR scam players, but they're a real thing, and it is something that you can rely on. Everybody likes to just say, oh, it's a PPR scam, and they just want to kind of sweep it under the rug, as that's not really relevant to like a normal wide receiver, but it really is.
Yeah, and then when I was looking at it from like a kind of like a more DFS angle or spike week angle for best ball, since that's what I'm deep in the weeds on. Um, and this was my original intent for this entire article was literally thinking about this from a Brian Thomas perspective. Um, it just came back to the fact that, you know what, I want to see like what the smash weeks look like, the boom weeks, the spike weeks, like the useful and bust weeks, and see like what this like mix looks like. And then I also want to take out like even the top like, you know, the people that go in the top two rounds and see if this all makes sense, right? And so every time I like paired back the data and said, hey, I'm going to take out your Pukas and your JSNs and whoever else that sits in that like first and second round, um, this same like pattern existed, and you can see it like the smash weeks are 5.8% from a short route depth player versus 2.8% for a smash for a deep route player. And so like while that is only a 3% difference, it is double. And that really does matter when you're looking at your DFS lineups because you're looking for that increased edge in any way that you can, right? Like a smash 25 plus point week is huge for DFS. It's huge for best ball. And then you look at the boom weeks and it's also double. And then you look at the spike weeks and it's close to double. And then, you know, even the bust and the distribution of all of this ends up being where you start seeing patterns where, hey, this guy's going to hit my lineup. People are worried about zeros in best ball. And these short depth guys are going to be more useful and they're also going to boom more. And that's like the biggest takeaway that I ended up having.
Yeah, I think that's a super important takeaway because one thing that I really started thinking about it and after I read this article is, really what it is when you get a reception, for however many yards, maybe it's got a touchdown, maybe it doesn't, but you've got basically from the line of scrimmage to where that player gets tackled or until they get to the end zone, that's what's available to you for the points that that player can score. But it's just so much easier to, if you can catch that ball 10 yards past the line of scrimmage and then you run another 50 and get the touchdown, I don't know if that's easier or harder, but you're gonna get, even if you get tackled, you're still getting that point for the reception. You're getting the 10 points for the 1 point for the 10 yards. So you're getting 2 points out of it no matter what. Whereas the guy who's going deep, he might eventually get that 60-yard touchdown, but how many throws is it going to take? How many throws are actually going to be receptions? So you basically, what you're doing is you're adding up all those single points for the reception in a PPR or half points per reception in a PPR that get you on down towards the end of the field. But it's not like, if you only throw the ball 10 yards, it doesn't stop the receiver from going the rest of the way on his own, if that makes sense.
No, it does, and see, like that's why kind of this like concept of getting the ball within like 5, 6, 7 yards of the line of scrimmage. Like Rashee Rice, super valuable. He's not even a great separator when I look at our fantasy points metrics or anything like that, but just sits in holes, and the offense is basically PPR scamming him. And what he's good at is he's good at creating yards after catch, and you get more yards after catch when you do these short routes because the defense is naturally dropping back a little bit. But he's got a little bit more wiggle than even your like average player. So he can turn some of those, 5-yard receptions into 15-yard receptions. And they use him a lot in the red zone too. And I think it's a skill, right? When guys are getting open short and they do that so often, that means that they can do that in the red zone as well, where they're sitting 5 yards underneath and they're finding little holes and creases in the red zone. And these deep guys aren't used to having to do that. And so you get even more touchdowns out of these short route depth players as well. And that's kind of like the Rashee Rice type of thing. And even like Amon-Ra St. Brown sits into that same like kind of realm where it's like, hey, one possession, he can get 5 receptions in one possession where that get him 50 yards, where like an A.D. Mitchell type, which I'm still into A.D. Mitchell, don't worry guys. An A.D. Mitchell type who's just running deep would do that on one play, but when you're looking at PPR, you want the 5 for 50, like
right,
instead of the 1 for 50. So I think it's all relative and valuable.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. All right, we got to take a quick break for a commercial. We will be right back.
The original player profiler was just my podcasting tool that I made available to the public so that you could follow along and look up the stats while I'm looking them up and talking about them on the show. And then you're asking, well, I want to dominate my drafts. I want to know what you know about Josh Downs and Trey Harris and Jalen Coker. So that's why we have the world famous draft kit. The key team insights, the player breakdowns, and the key stats that you need to know, like vacated targets, vacated touches, all there available to you with cheat sheets for every format and interactive drafting as you draft. The players fly off the board. And this year, for the first time, I am publishing my personal draft cheat sheet during draft season, as well as Bradley's. And when you sign up for the all-in package, you get $25 off with code PODFATHER. Code PODFATHER, $25 off. The world famous draft kit is now live. It is ready. It is complete. So go grab it and dominate your drafts.
All right, and we're back. So Zane, I thought that was an interesting point you made just before the break. About like a Rashee Rice and how he can get open in short areas, and I think that is really a skill, and that's why I hadn't really thought about it. In how that these short area players do get more valuable, because a lot of times the deep route specialists, they tend to be the ones who are like, if they're going to get the ball in the end zone, it's sort of a high point situation, or dragging across the back of the end zone or something like that. Whereas those players who can work open right at the goal line, or just behind the goal line, or just in front of it, open up a whole different area of the field for the quarterback to throw to. So it makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, you play in that more like specialist type of role where you're getting the short routes, and then you're used to creating the yards after catch. If you catch it at the 5-yard line and you're a short route guy, you're more likely, because we see this with the yak distribution too. The guys that actually are deep threats, I didn't put this in the article, the guys that are the deep threats are worse at yak too, even on the short routes, because they don't get that opportunity as often. And so when you catch the ball at the 5-yard line, a guy like Rashee Rice is more likely to score the touchdown when he catches at the 5-yard line versus a guy like Eden Mitchell, just because of their skill set when it comes to breaking tackles and yak.
Yeah, it totally makes sense, because, the deeper balls, the quarterback, a lot of times they look even a little bit more accurate than they are, because some of their accuracy is just the wide receiver down the field adjusting to the ball. And, when you're having to do a lot of adjustment to the ball, it kind of ruins your momentum, as far as being able to, make yards after the catch. Whereas when you're on these short and intermediate routes, especially if you're moving, across the formation, which is why I really like players who do a lot of end-breaking routes, because they're continuing to move, and they're at such a spot where the quarterback can hopefully lead them, where they don't really have to break stride, or else they just have to break stride a little bit to catch that ball, and they can keep right on moving. So, all these things kind of explain why our short area and intermediate area wide receivers, I think, are the better choices when you have the option.
Yeah, exactly. And, I tried to look at it by ADP too. So I talked about this already, where I said I stripped out like the top 2 round guys just to like see how this methodology plays out. I think some of it is priced into ADP, where the deeper route players are somewhat cheaper in fantasy, but you start seeing them show up more in this like round 4 through and then beyond area. Whereas some of like the premier short route guys are still like in the first 3 rounds, but there's still a mix of players that are short route guys in the round 4 through whatever range. And then there's also, so that's where you start doing the comparison and trade-offs, right? Where you start thinking through like, okay, I'm at my draft seat right now. If I'm looking at if I'm staring down the barrel and seeing a Brian Thomas, who's for all intents and purposes going to be a deep threat again this year, based off of all reports that I've put out there, and his metrics from last year, what they did with him once they got Jakobi Meyers. You're sitting there and you're thinking about, okay, I've got Brian Thomas on the board, and then there's another guy that's on the board that comes a little bit later, in like Josh Downs, who's more of a short area guy, and that I expect to actually be more of a full-time player this year. And you think about the trade-offs, and you're like, well, I can just take Josh Downs in like 2 rounds, and take a running back here, or take one of the elite quarterbacks or something like that, right? So that's like the methodology that I'm starting to play out in my drafts right now when I'm thinking about how to like make this effective for myself and then, for all the listeners.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So I'm curious, when you were looking at this average depth of route, I assume that's basically the same thing as average depth of target, right?
No, so the target average depth of target is on the plays where you actually get targeted. Average
Okay,
depth of route is every single route that you run. So
got it.
if you're running a slant and you don't get targeted, if you're running a go route and you don't get targeted, those are factored into that as well. It's a little bit of a more like new metric, something that I'm able to create through my fantasy points contribution. But I think it's something that if that we're going to be exposing and talking through for the rest of the season to make sure that people are able to understand which players are switching roles, if at all switching roles, and then and how that's going to apply for the rest of the season. If there's guys that you may want to drop or guys that you want to pick up because of the role changes that we end up seeing.
Okay, yeah, that's great. That's an interesting thing. So, is average depth of the route, is that something that's available right now on Fantasy Points data, or is it something that you have to kind of work towards?
It will be exposed a little bit more soon. There are different ways to get it. You'd have to pull like multiple reports. I think what we're trying to accomplish is just making that kind of like a one report, one stop shop type of thing. There's going to be updates to the Fantasy Points data suite that's going to happen later this month or early August, and that's going to give people access to being able to like explore this type of analysis a little bit more and more on top of that as well.
Nice, nice. So, how sticky is average depth of route year over year? Have you done any looking into that?
Yeah. So I was looking into that because I wanted to understand, like, okay, guys change teams, right? We've got Jalen Waddle, who's going from his role in Miami to his role in Denver. And what happens when players change teams? Now we have less players that are like worth a lot in fantasy that change teams. So it's a smaller sample. But generally, the route depth sticks with a player regardless if they change teams or stay on the same team, or if they have a coordinator change or whatever ends up happening. It's kind of like this is your specialty role. You are this type of player, and that kind of sticks with you. The times that it happens a little bit less often, it usually stays with the player throughout their career. But the times that it happens a little bit less often is people that are really early in their career, right? So like year one, there's players that end up doing like, hey, I just got to fill the X receiver role for the season, but then they develop into a different type of player the next year. You can almost think of like JSN's actually a decent example. He wasn't a deep threat necessarily his first year, but he wasn't getting all of these like easy button targets underneath, and then they get rid of some of their other players with Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf. And now he's kind of like the focal point in the offense. They try to design like short area stuff for him, right? So that's one example. I think you could see like even Emeka Egbuka is like a decent example. He had to step into an X receiver role last year when Mike Evans went down, and so that changes his route depth. Instead of being more of the Z or slot receiver where you're going to get this short to intermediate stuff more often. And this year he's expected to be more of the Z receiver. Maybe spelling Chris Godwin in the slot if Godwin were to go down, or if Godwin's taking like a breather too. So those are kind of like the situations that I'm thinking through for these players, like early career guys. You got to kind of think through like what's happening. And then I was also thinking about it for guys that have like big departures, or if there's overlapping skill sets in a team, like has two guys that kind of play a similar type of role. So I actually tweeted this out maybe yesterday or 2 days ago. I was thinking about this for Matthew Golden and Christian Watson, right? They didn't play that often together. They weren't on the field that much together running routes. They had about a 52 route sample together. And when they did, Christian Watson was the deep threat and Matthew Golden was the more like intermediate threat. Whereas when Matthew Golden wasn't on the field, Watson was doing a little bit more of the intermediate. He was still a deep threat, but he was like less of a deep threat than he was. So I'm trying to translate that back into like what's going to happen for this year. And I'm struggling because I didn't write about him in this article as a fade because I'm having a tough time actually wanting to fade him, knowing that I still think that he's like a really good player and has like capabilities beyond what he's been asked to do. So what I did was I stuck to the guys that I really felt were the guys that I want to fade in the article because I'm confident that their role is going to stay constant. I'm confident that that their situation isn't going to play out in the way that I actually want it to play out for them. And then there's like fringe guys that I was like a little bit nervous to write about that if I wanted to be super bold, I would have put them in the article, but I didn't want to be as bold as I probably should have.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it's good to kind of go at it from the direction when you did. Well, these are the players I'm confident about, and we can play the wait and see game with some of these. Pardon me, with some of these other players and see how they turn out. Since this is a relatively new concept that you're looking at, a little bit more data, a little bit more nuance is only going to help us figure out how to use it better because, with anything, context is king. And every player has a lot of different context around them. So, and also I too.
The interesting thing about it too, I was just going to say the interesting thing about it too is that, the charted data from Fantasy Points is from 2021 to 2025, right? So that's like 5 seasons worth of data. The issue with that is that this too high, like Vic Fangio type of defense, that is basically designed to keep people from blowing the top off of the defense is pretty much the era that we've operated in since the charting data was available. And so you kind of have to put that into context too. Are things changing with the NFL meta that's going to make this like less relevant, that deep threats might actually like come back into play as like true big spike weak players or something like a Randy Moss, right? I'm thinking about him and how like this guy would have, 5 if I remember correctly, it was 3 catches versus the Cowboys on Thanksgiving in 1998 for 164 yards and two touchdowns. Like that kind of thing existed and now it does not as often. And so what I'm trying to understand is whether that's going to change. And I actually think that defenses are leaning heavier into this Vic Fangio style of the 2 high shells and making it a little bit more confusing, making quarterbacks need to get the ball out quicker to these short route guys. So that's like the other application that I've been thinking through with all of this too. Should we talk about the targets and fades a little bit?
Yeah, let's definitely do that. Because I'm with you. I had a hard time, looking at this data. One of the first players I thought about was Christian Watson. I was like, I don't really want to fade that guy. So, but what
I can mention a couple of players that I didn't put in the article that I think might fit these profiles. If people want like hey, this guy might be in here, but I just didn't want to put him on paper. So you guys can check out the article and read more about the individual players, and we'll talk about all of them here. But the guys that fit into this bucket that I wasn't certain on, from a deep perspective that I would potentially fade, Jameson Williams, deep threat. And notably, like the first half of the season last year, he played that role more. And then Sam Laporta got injured, and then Dan Campbell took on play calling. And then like his role changed a little bit and became more of a focal point in the offense. So that's why I kind of left him out. Was they have a coordinator change with Drew Petzing. Not exactly sure how they're going to deploy him versus Sam Laporta. I mean, he's probably still going to be the deep threat, but at the same time, like maybe Isaac Tesla, since he's the going to be like the X receiver, maybe he does more of the deep stuff, and then Jameson Williams does a little bit more intermediate that keeps him more relevant and focused in the offense. So I didn't necessarily write him in. And then the other part about him is that you can get burned by fading him, because we saw what happens when Sam Laporta gets injured. We saw what could happen if Amon-Ra were to miss time. And then you're sitting in a situation where like this guy ends up being a round 3 value the weeks that those guys are out, and you're just kind of scared to like end up being in that position. So it's hard to fade a guy that's going to be on an offense that throws for 4,500 yards. Those offenses are fewer and far between these days.
Yeah, and especially with a guy like Jameson, who's got that skill set that is, very malleable, and he can be used intermediate, he can be used deep, he can even be used shallow.
Yeah, and then the other guy that kind of fits into this, that I'm somewhat now I feel like his ADP has moved up enough to where I'm probably comfortable putting him in the fade category, but it's Quentin Johnston. So at the original time when I started writing this, I think his ADP was in the 90s, and now he's in like the 70s on Underdog or something. And it's all because some of these news reports that have come out that are saying like, hey, he's going to be in a yak friendly like role. So we're going to do some more like short area stuff and whatnot. And they want to get the ball out in 2.5 seconds. The Chargers do. And so like thinking about him, he's been a deep threat his entire career, but you listen to Matt Harmon, you listen to even guys from Fantasy Points that are like doing some of the separation, like charting and stuff like that. They miscast him in like this X receiver role where he should be running down the field and just like kind of trying to get open on a go route instead of, hey, we're going to throw this guy like a drag route or a screen or a slant and get him really involved in this offense so he can break tackles and take its distance. Coming out, his profile was more of like a Deebo Samuel type rather than like the way they deployed him. And so that's why I'm a little bit worried about this is one of those situations where coordinator change and all the coach speak that's coming out about them doing like these yak heavy, get the ball out in 2.5 seconds type of stuff turns into maybe he's not a deep threat this year. Maybe they put Trey Harris into that role whenever they go in 11 personnel and they try to keep him and Ladd kind of like short and intermediate instead. And so that's my main concern with him. I don't think he's a great pick right now because he's moved up too close to other guys that I just like taking. But back when he was going in the 90s, I felt like, man, this guy could actually do a lot. And then it was good to like stack him up with Justin Herbert too, which you could take Herbert first and then take Quentin Johnston right after that.
Yeah, that definitely made a lot of sense. And I've been off of Quentin Johnston for the same reasons as you, basically. Since he's moved up so far, where he was going was pretty acceptable, but at this point, it's like it's pretty hard to click that button with some of the other names around him. Curious, so we're avoiding Brian Thomas Jr. pretty much, assuming that he keeps that deep role. Does that mean we should be all in on Parker Washington, or do you think that there's going to be just too many wide receivers involved here?
This is the $1 million question that everybody keeps asking. And the interesting thing is that Parker Washington doesn't have the short role either. He doesn't have the deep role, but he's more of like the intermediate target. Jacoby is the short guy. Parker Washington is both short and intermediate with a little bit of deep. He kind of operates at all three levels, but not enough as a deep threat. And then Jacoby does more so just short and intermediate. And then Brenton Strange is short and intermediate too, for the most part. This is one where I move my take to, yes, I would rather invest in Parker Washington. But the reason why is not because of his depth. It's because of the role in the offense where he's pretty much guaranteed to be the slot receiver in Liam Cohen's offense, which has produced players that have put up elite fantasy numbers in that specific slot role. And, a lot of people are wondering, like, they drafted a tight end in the second round. And then they got Koziol 2 in round, I think it was 5. Are they going to do more like 12 and 13 personnel? And my take on that is that everything that I'm reading doesn't point to them doing it enough more for it to really matter. I think they did it like 20% of the time last year. Maybe that kicks up like 3-4%. And that's just going to that might be like one route for a player, in a game. And so I'm not really that worried about it. I think those are more like long-term investments, especially as these receivers potentially leave the team over time. And I think Parker Washington's going to get an extension. So I think he's going to be here for a while. He's a guy that's going to be turning 30 at some point soon. And then they could potentially think about that. If they want to get Travis Hunter more involved in the offense. They have the opportunity to do that by potentially, there's been a lot of chatter about trading Brian Thomas. If he's able to put up some good weeks, maybe they do something like that. They actually did explore it this offseason, so it's not like too far-fetched for that to actually end up happening. So I think the 12 and 13 personnel is something that will potentially happen, but it'll just be something that could be like a 2027, like more uptick that I'd be more concerned about. And then people are also probably wondering, like with Parker Washington, is he going to play outside ever? Is he going to play in two wide receiver sets? Liam Cohen literally talked about this. He said he called him a good player on the outside and on the inside. And that wasn't talking about like his drive and his grit, like his heart. I was talking about him on the spot and on the outside, like as an outside receiver. I mean, if you look at the metrics, I think I broke this down on X2, but he actually had a higher targets per route run as an outside receiver and yards per route run. It was pretty close to being the same, but it just proves that, and he played equally outside and in the slot last year, that he has that capability. So I think once his contract extension comes into play, which I think will happen near training camp, and they're saying it'll be close to the Jaden Reed deal where it's like 16 years. Once that happens, I think his price is going to go up even more because that will show the long-term commitment and monetary value that people are going to say, well, crap, this guy is like a big part of their plans. So yeah, I would invest in him now.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And, the wide receiver I'm least interested in investing in probably is Jacoby Myers, just because he doesn't have the same sort of dynamism that Parker Washington does after the catch. I mean, I think Parker Washington has proven to be a much better player than what fantasy gamers expected him to be, certainly over the last 10 weeks of last year. But I know a lot of them are just considering that, that was just a short-term thing. It was because Travis Hunter was injured or whatever. And, I just don't see it that way at all. And I'm with you on the 12 personnel. I think they probably did that more to improve the running game, and I think that's where it's going to show up more often for Jacksonville, especially if they can get a lead late, going a lot more towards 12 personnel and being able to close out the game. But I think the main thing it did was it just allowed them to, if they've got, a much better Y tight end, then they can shift Strange out to the F tight end. And they've got superior blocking ability, and also they've got a guy in Strange that can be a threat in the passing game. So, defenses can't play it as straight run either. So I think that's what they were probably looking to do.
Yeah. I think I mentioned this. I think I mentioned this a little bit in our pre-show. So I did like data charting last year for fantasy points. A lot of this comes back to like my film background and just being able to like analyze and see what's going on. And that was one of the reasons why I decided to do it. And I did a lot of the Jaguars games. I actually wrote a big article on breaking down their film last year. And one of the things that I noticed was, when they did do this, like just thinking through, like they had Quentin Morris, I believe, lined up in that like blocking role. Which that guy, has no athletic bones in his body, doesn't present any sort of like receiving threat for the offense. And so what I think they wanted to do is like, what if we change Quentin Morris to a guy that if we like leaked him out a couple of times, like Nate Boericker is a good athlete. He didn't have great like receiving stats, but he's a good athlete. So they can theoretically like at least leak him out on some play action plays and like get something out of that spot instead of like nobody paying attention to Quentin Morris. And I think that's like kind of the situation that they're trying to put him in.
Yeah, makes sense. So what do you think about just moving on to some other teams? How about the Panthers? Ted McMillan versus Jalen Coker, or even throw in Xavier Legette if you want.
Yeah, so I'm not even certain that Xavier, based on reports, I'm not even sure that Xavier Legette will be their wide receiver 3, at least for the entire season. And notice I said wide receiver 3, which means that Jalen Coker is their guaranteed wide receiver 2. When they go into wide receiver sets, it'll always be Jalen Coker. I believe last year they were in 3 wide receiver sets on pass plays for like 79% of the time. So they're not even going to do a 2 wide receiver set that often anyway. But if they do, Jalen Coker will be on the field. He's pretty much going to be an every down player for them. and so will Tet McMillan. The difference between the two is obviously that Tet McMillan had 1,000 yards last year. He did it in a big sample size throughout the season last year, and he has the draft capital, and Jalen Coker doesn't. Jalen Coker has the contract that they just gave him. They operate kind of in a different way, different spaces. Tet does go a little bit deeper sometimes, not always. He's not a deep threat. He operates at all three levels of the field, and Coker kind of stays more like short and intermediate, which to me is more obviously a little bit more valuable. And then we ended up seeing kind of how it played out in the playoff game, where Jalen Coker was obviously they were using him as the secondary receiver, but the Rams decided we're going to commit all of our resources to stopping Tet McMillan, and it's very possible that we see defenses do that. So their stats actually might end up being more closely aligned than most people would like to think, because of the way that defenses will shift things a lot towards Tet McMillan this year. The problem is that I don't foresee the Panthers being this like dynamic passing offense that gets more than even like 3,600 passing yards this season, right? I think last year Bryce Young had roughly like 3,200 off the top of my head, something like that, which makes it really tough to support too many weapons in that offense. The good thing is that they don't really have any tight ends or anybody else that's going to eat into it too much. So you're basically talking about two guys consolidating a lot of that offense in general. Projection-wise, for Jalen Coker, I would say you can expect something between 600 to 800 yards. That's a wide range, but that's where I would kind of see him fitting in. And then Tet has obviously the higher ceiling because he is the better talent. I'll just, that shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. But he's also dealing with a little bit of a foot injury, and he was dealing with that at OTAs, and he's had a history of a foot injury that dates back to college, that I don't know everybody knows about, that I'm a little bit concerned about because it seems like it's more of like a stress reaction type of thing. And so I'm a little bit scared where he sits right now, at like a third round ADP or like early fourth round, wherever he's falling to at this point in time, that he's just I don't see the ceiling of him getting to 1,400 yards where when you're taking a guy in that third, fourth round range, you're hoping that he could be a second or first rounder.
Yep.
I just don't see it happening for him this year, even though he has the talent. It mostly comes down to like pass yards and what that offense can do. But I can see a way that Jalen Coker like pays off at his ADP, by getting like, if he got 800 yards at a 120 or 130 ADP, that's pretty good.
Yeah, definitely. And Coker is also a good weapon in the red zone, as is Tet McMillan. Both of them are. I think kind of the path for Coker is it really needs to be pretty heavily consolidated between the two wide receivers, not a tight end of consequence, not a third receiver of consequence. We're looking for Chris Brazell to be playing, kind of sacrificial X, Leggett to just not really be that much of a factor. And if that happens, I think it works for Coker because, teams will be shading their coverage more towards Tet. And I'm right with you on Tet. I don't see how I can see him paying off his ADP, but not, becoming a smash pick or anything like that. And in that range, I'd just rather take the players that I feel like can be smash picks.
Yeah.
How about the
one of the trade-offs I actually have in my article is Tet versus Garrett Wilson. And so I wrote about Garrett Wilson, where he's kind of sat in that ADOR, the average depth of route sweet spot every single year of his career, and has been a short area guy for every single season of his career. So that mix for me, like I know, you could say almost similar things about Geno in some ways, like his floor of getting to 3,200 yards is definitely possible, especially with Frank Reich. Like nobody knows how this is going to end up playing out. But the way I see it is that, one, I think that Garrett Wilson is a more polished player at this point in time in his career than Tet McMillan. Two, he runs a more friendly like route distribution tree in terms of depth and then what he actually runs, like slants and stuff like that. And so my thought process on him is, there was a lot of people that have put out like O-line rankings recently. I think only one place had the Jets ranked pretty low, but Geno Smith is notably way better when he's not under pressure. And last year he was under pressure all the time. Their offensive line was quite literally one of the worst offensive lines that we've seen in the past like 5 years. And so I think with a little bit more time to throw, you're going to see a guy like Garrett Wilson really stand out this year. I'm not worried about all the weapons that they added in the first round. I think those guys are good players that could support the team this season, but they still need some development. Like Sadiq isn't a guy that's going to go out there and get 1,000 yards his first year. He's not a Loveland style type of guy. And same with Omar Cooper. He's not like this is like a rookie that's going to go out there and get 1,000 yards immediately type of player either. Like these are two guys that need maybe a year of development before they're able to be 1,000-yard type of player. So I think this is the year to buy in on Garrett Wilson, given like the environment as a whole for him.
Yeah, I think that definitely makes sense. We got a question from one of the viewers asking, how about the Commanders wide receiver room? Do you have any thoughts on that, Zane?
Yeah, it's a hard. So right now, I think I watch so I read a lot of news, and then I also watch a lot of fantasy content to keep myself like abreast of what the market is feeling, what people are thinking. If you look at rankings across so many different websites, people have Terry McLaurin ranked higher than his ADP pretty much across the board. And most fantasy analysts will tell you that he's a really good pick right now. And at the moment, I kind of agree. But he goes around guys that I really, really like. And then I also think that they're super live to add a difference maker veteran wide receiver like Stephon Diggs. From all reports that I've read, from The Athletic to ESPN, they're doing wide receiver 2 by committee at the moment. But every time you read an article, it brings up Brandon Ayuk, who now I think is not going to be in the mix. And then it brings up Stephon Diggs. And Stephon Diggs is in this article too, as somebody that I think is still a really dynamic weapon, someone that can take away from a guy like Terry McLaurin because he is that good still. So I'm a little bit scared at his cost right now because if they do sign Stephon Diggs, he's going to drop in ADP. And he goes right next to a guy that I wrote about in this article too, Jalen Waddle, that I really, really like. And so that's why I'm still a little bit scared to take Terry McLaurin at this moment in time compared to what his cost is. If he were to fall like past DJ Moore, so maybe like 5-6 picks, like half a round, I'm good with taking him because I think that's probably around where he might end up going if they do sign Diggs. But right now it's not the area that I want to be drafting in. And if you're talking about the other receivers in the receiver room, Antonio Williams, Treylon Burks, those other guys that are out there, I think they have De'Ami Brown.
Yep.
It's just a mixed bag at the moment. I do expect them to be in 12 personnel more often. And so what that does is take away that slot role. And by all accounts, it sounds like Antonio Williams is more of like that slot role right now. So that means that's going to take away from Antonio Williams' route share. So that means that you're going to get more Ben Sinnott along with Chigo Okonkwo. And so my actual favorite pick of all of these Commanders' weapons, if you include the tight ends, is Chig. Because I think he's going to set a career high in his route participation. If I had to guess, so I think his career rate is roughly like 55%. If I had to guess, I think he'll be north of 70, which is really, really strong for a tight end, especially for a tight end that's going later on. Now, I'm not saying this is a guy that can get 1,000 yards. Like, that is very few tight ends. But could he, in a really strong situation, end up with 800 yards? Yes, I think he's totally live to get 800 yards this season. And that would be a really strong payoff at his cost. I think he's going at like 140, 145. So,
yeah, something like that. So it definitely makes him intriguing, and plus if he's getting anywhere close to 100 targets, which would likely be the case if they don't add anybody to the wide receiver room. I think the Diggs thesis probably has more effect on Chig than it has on McLaurin, but I think it's fair to say McLaurin will definitely go a little bit cheaper, and for that reason, I've also been kind of not I'm still taking him some, but I'm not taking him unless he drops just a little bit from where he normally goes. So, but Chig is the one that I've been kind of just taking if he falls a little bit, and he's somebody that if I see they don't add a Diggs or somebody like that, then I'm going to start jumping into a lot more. And
yeah,
just from that, have you taken a look at the tight end position through this lens at all, or is that anything that you're thinking about doing at any point?
The tight ends don't run deep as often.
Right.
But if you do think about it from a tight end perspective, there's guys like Kyle Pitts in 2023 who they effectively put in a deep route role. And the biggest comparison that I have for him is Terrence Ferguson from last year. And Terrence Ferguson was not a full-time player last year, but he had basically like a 35% route participation in 2025. All reports about him are that they're kind of viewing him as their wide receiver 3 in this offense at the moment if they don't sign like a veteran free agent. And so him being a wide receiver 3 for them, the way that they're thinking about deploying him is kind of similar to how Tutu Atwell was deployed, which we know is more of like the deep route, like sacrificial, somewhat type of role. And so Terrence Ferguson kind of fits more of the Kyle Pitts profile of what happened in 2023, where Kyle Pitts ran a lot of routes. He was on the field a lot for the team, but he was a big fantasy disappointment for everybody because he only got like 600 yards. Now 600 yards if you're looking at best ball specifically, and you're thinking about Terrence Ferguson in round 18, that's a great pick from a tight end. But if you're thinking about like redraft, is this guy going to be on my lineup? Am I going to be able to count on him week to week? No, it's going to be super volatile. And he's going to bust more often than not. Maybe he'll have 1 or 2 spike weeks this entire season. And that's worth it as an 18th round best ball pick, but it's so much of a headache for managed leagues.
Yeah.
So there aren't too many like deep threat tight ends that end up coming into play, but if there are some, the one that stands out right now is Terrence Ferguson.
Makes sense. All right, let's circle back around to the rookie. Somebody was asking about Mekhi Lemon earlier in the show. Does your research lead you towards drafting any of the rookie wide receivers where they're going in drafts, or are you just waiting to see what happens on them?
I'm maybe famously somewhat fading Carnell Tate. But I will say this, my perspective on fades aren't that I'm not going to take this guy like ever. I'm building a portfolio. When I draft, I'm building a portfolio. If I had one draft, I would not take Carnell Tate. I think the talent is immense. I think the situation is not good for fantasy currently. If anyone's following me, you can tell based off of some of my Titans tweets that one, I believe that he's going to be in more of that X receiver role. I wouldn't say that he's going to be a 25% plus deep threat player. But in college, he was really good at the deep plays. Like that's one of the traits that were really attractive about him. That doesn't mean he can't do the intermediate and short stuff too. But when you look at like the players around him, it kind of shows you what the different players might end up doing, right? So they added Wan'Dale Robinson to a sizable contract in the offseason. Wan'Dale Robinson is normally a shorter average depth of route and average depth of target player. So he's going to operate in more of that short and intermediate role. And then if you look at the O-line rankings that every single person has, and if you just read the tea leaves of, hey, they've got like 3 interior lineman positions that are kind of up in the air, you should be scared about that offensive line for the Titans. And when you have poor offensive line play, especially from on the interior, you end up seeing quick pressure. And quick pressure usually means getting the ball out quick, right? You look at players that have a 2.5 second passes within 2.5 seconds. That's when you start to see guys basically lean into this like short play role, and that's what you're going to get from Wan'Dale Robinson. If projection wise, if you're just like thinking about it, stratifying it in my head right now, I think Wan'Dale and Carnell Tate basically will get the same amount of yards. And it just depends on, and I don't want to be a hot take artist, but I actually think that they will get roughly the same amount of yards. You're talking about a guy that goes, at pick 120 or something, or 115 versus a guy that's going at like 65 or 66 or something like that. So that's the one where I'm like, these two things just kind of don't match up for me as well. I don't know if you have a question on that though, because like I know the guy asked about Mekhi Lemon, and I'll get to him too. But if you have something to say on Carnell Tate versus Wandale, I'm open to it.
No, I think you're looking at it the right way, and the way I look at it is Wandale. If they get to the same number of yards, then it's going to be a smash for Wandale because he's going to get so many more receptions on the way, unless Carnell Tate just happens to be a huge touchdown monster somehow. So I'm with you there. What about Mekhi Lemon, Jordan Tyson, any of those guys?
Yeah. So with Mekhi Lemon, one, I think this could be a little bit of a hot take to people too, but I think he's their primary slot player. What does that mean from a fantasy angle? I'm not 100% sure that he will be on the field in every single situation. Now they spent a first round pick on him. Does that mean that they're guaranteed to give him like a, every single down, every single route roll? I actually did analysis on this offseason. And for the most part, these guys end up getting 70% route shares at some point in the season. These like 20th, like 19th, 20th round, 20th like area picks, like a Mekhi Lemon. A lot of it still starts out early where they're doing like 60% route shares, and then eventually getting to 70-ish. The problem is that I think that this team wants to be in two tight end sets sometimes too. They changed coordinators to Sean Mannion. Sean Mannion is coming from the Matt LaFleur offense where they do a lot of two tight end sets. They added Eli Stowers, who I think is going to be more of a like very short time player, but they'll probably try to find specialized situations for them to get him into the game, and he'll probably end up being in like that slot role. So he's going to share the slot a little bit with Eli Stowers. And then I think Dontavian Wicks is the outside receiver. And so that like scares me when it comes to a playing time perspective. Like there's fewer and fewer receivers. Someone asked this in the chat too earlier. I saw it. Is it true that wide receiver 2 is dead? I wouldn't say always, but there's fewer and fewer receivers that are getting to 70+% route share every single year. We're seeing teams deploy rotations, putting people in specialized skill sets. And so I'm worried about it. The good thing is that I do expect him to be in the short role, right? Comparative to Dontavian Wicks and others. The only problem that I have with that is that the fit with Jalen Hurts, attacking the middle of the field. Jalen Hurts is notably like way better when it comes to targeting the outside, like beyond the hash mark, like receivers, mainly deep throws. He's one of the guys that you're like, well, maybe I want to lean into the deep threat a little bit more. And so that's what scares me off of Mekhi Lemon. Again, I said this earlier, but I want to caveat some of these things that I end up saying, that my general thesis around this is that you can't, if you're doing a portfolio, you can't fade every single player that's early round picks, because you never know when you need a guy like Mekhi Lemon who, let's say Devonta Smith is out and they just have to put him in at like a Z receiver type of role, and he's doing a bunch of different nuanced things. You don't fade that, because you're going to end up, if you get 2% of him, like that team could still end up winning because of the role that he ends up having when it matters in, week 15, 16, 17. But for the most part, when I'm building a portfolio, what's the most likely thing to happen? That's when I'm starting to like fade guys a little bit more. And Mekhi Lemon would fit into that profile a little bit for me.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think when the season starts, it just basically is, like a giant 50-car pileup on the freeway. You just don't know exactly what's going to happen once the season starts. And there's so much chaos going on that, we think we have everything solved, in July and August and early September, and then all the season starts, and we see guys in different roles than what we expected, or injuries changing the way that teams go about attacking, the defense. There's just so many different things that can happen, and if you go into it, I think with with your mind made up too much, and that I'm going to hard fade, a whole lot of players, and I'm going to really be super heavy on a few players, that will probably end up burning you unless you just happen to be incredibly lucky.
Yeah, I completely agree. The other thing with Mekhi Lemon is that I actually noticed this before even the beat writers noticed this, but I saw a clip of him with a sleeve on his leg, and I knew that I did not see him with a sleeve on his leg in previous practices. And it turns out he was missing practice that day with a hamstring issue, and I speculated that before anyone else got to it. And I don't like seeing rookies start off with any sort of soft tissue things. He's going to be fine for training camp, for the start of training camp, but now you just know that there's like some twinge there. And this next guy that we're talking about too, Jordan Tyson, also has the same issue. And that's my scare with him. I think that he's actually the rookie that I would target out of any of these guys that we're talking about, between him, Mekhi Lemon, and Carnell Tate. I think he has the chance to do have the biggest role, biggest effect in fantasy. Could be a smash, all that kind of stuff. The only concern with for me with Jordan Tyson is whether he can stay healthy. And I do think that he would more so take on that intermediate and short role than a Chris Olave. Chris Olave is like a premier, somewhat deep threat. They've allowed him to do like the intermediate and short a little bit more than like your typical deep threat, but he's a really good deep wide receiver. And now that they have like an actual useful wide receiver too at play that doesn't necessarily do it the same way he does. Like they had Rashid Shaheed with him before. And so like Shaheed and him had similar talents where you're kind of saying like, hey, we're going to send you on a go ball. And now you've got Jordan Tyson who can operate in like tighter spaces and do kind of like the short area stuff, a true like slant god. I can see Chris Olave working deeper more often this year, with Jordan Tyson taking more of the short intermediate stuff on slants and different things like that. And so I really like Jordan Tyson. I think he could be a really good pick. We just need him to be healthy. And we don't know if that's going to be the case, but that's like
I like hearing that though, because I've been very strong on Jordan Tyson this entire offseason. And the only thing that's been stopping me from hitting the button even more often is the hammies, and just worried about the possibility of injury. One more quick one before we get you out of here, but any interest in either of the Cleveland rookie wide receivers?
Yeah, so the reports out of camp have been really interesting. I actually think both are really good talents. I think Casey Conception was probably drafted 5 to 10 picks too late in the real NFL draft. I think that he is a really good, strong, really good receiver. I'm less, from a talent evaluation standpoint, I put way less value on being able to catch the football than most other people would, because I think that's a really there's only a few players that you're like, this guy drops the ball way too much. And even if you look at drops year over year, they don't always translate to the same players. There are players that we think about like Dontavian Wicks and A.D. Mitchell where we're like, these guys can't catch the ball. But for the most part, guys that drop the ball are usually okay catching the ball in most situations. So I'm not as worried about that with him. And then Denzel Boston, I also thought was a first-round talent this year. Was a little bit surprised that he fell, because the importance that the premium that people put on first-round wide receivers, or that people put on receivers in general in the NFL, and the contracts that we're seeing for even a guy like Alec Pierce, who truly does run wind sprints a lot in the game. And so I thought that Denzel Boston would have been a first-round pick. So I think both of those guys are really good talents. Now, when we go to the reports of what happened at a training camp, they really like Denzel Boston as an outside receiver. And so I think that, and I do think that this team is live to do some, 12 personnel type of stuff with Todd Monken at the helm. So I think that if you're targeting one of them, he is going to run more routes than Casey Conception this year. That's for the full season. Now, if you're looking at it when you're talking about mid to late season, do we think that Jerry Jeudy eventually kind of goes away by the wayside? Definitely by end of season, I think that's what's going to end up happening for Jerry Jeudy, because I don't think this team is going to be competing for anything significant. And so when you get close to the end of the season, you start seeing these veterans kind of like, all right, I've got a little bruise. I'm sitting for this week. So I think Casey Conception might be like the guy you want for the playoffs. But if you're looking for who's going to get like a 75% plus route share, like right out of the gate, it's going to be Denzel Boston. If I had to guess right now.
Yeah, that's interesting. I find myself definitely taking some Denzel Boston. I've been getting some KC in there when he drops, and Jerry Jeudy. For the most part, I haven't been interested in him unless he really drops, because I think the only way he's going to really be relevant past the first few weeks of the year is if they end up trading him to a different team. I just don't see it otherwise. I think they've got to focus more on their future, and I just don't see Jeudy as part of the Browns' future.
I completely agree, and I'm also probably the only guy out here. I'm not a Shedeur Sanders fan by any means, but I do think that he raises the floor for these receivers if he is the quarterback, because he is not afraid to just throw the ball up into like triple coverage and make tight window throws, and just like YOLO balls is like exactly what he does. And I think that can translate to random spikes. Like, do I think that Deshaun Watson is going to get 350 passing yards in a game? I don't. Do I think that Shedeur Sanders will? Probably not, but I actually think that he has a stronger chance of doing it because he's not afraid to just launch it and put it into like really poor situations. Terrible NFL quarterback could be something that's worth something for fantasy. It's like a Jameis Winston light situation where you're like, all right, Jameis threw like 27 interceptions one season with like 28 touchdowns or something. I don't remember the exact numbers, but I could see a situation where in one game, Shedeur has 3 touchdowns and 3 interceptions, and that's just what ends up happening. And that's what we want to see for fantasy. We want guys that are going to put things in traffic and let their players like make plays and be unafraid to just get rid of it.
Yeah, Jameis is the dream fantasy quarterback because he's a one-man fantasy carnival. He's just making points for everybody, making points for the defense, making points for his own team. We love to see it. So, all right, well, Zane, I appreciate you joining me today. We'll go ahead and get you out of here. Normally, we try to keep the show down to about 60 minutes or so, but we're going long because it's been so good. So we appreciate that. Remind us again where we can listen to you and find your work.
Yeah, so I've got 2 things. My written content you can find on fantasypoints.com. Most of my articles will end up being free. I am going to release something that I've been tracking through camp, along with stats that go and support or don't support those news blurbs. And then I do have my own YouTube channel. The Cut Up Show is what you can find. Where I'm streaming it from there right now as well. And then you can find me on Twitter at Denani Zane also.
Awesome. And for my audience, thank you for watching or listening. Make sure that you're hitting the like button. It's free, it's easy, and if you can, leave a review wherever you happen to be consuming this show. Make sure you're tuning in too. Next Thursday, I'm going to be talking to Jared Smola. He's another great data analyst and a very sharp drafter. So looking forward to that as well. My goal is always to bring you to the best and brightest of the fantasy football world. So make sure you subscribe to the Player Profiler Network on YouTube and your podcast provider. You don't want to miss a single show. That's it for this week. So until next week, get out there and dominate your drafts.